Our guest is Professor Jane Hong. She's an associate professor of U.S. history at Occidental College, and her research focuses on immigration, race, and U.S. engagement with the world. She's currently writing a book about race and evangelical politics for Oxford University Press, and she's also appeared in 2 episodes of the Peabody Award-winning PBS docuseries Asian Americans, and has penned co-ops for the Washington Post and Los Angeles Times. But today we're going to be speaking with Professor Hong about her book, Opening the Gates to Asia, a Transpacific History of How America Repealed Asian Exclusion. Professor Hong, welcome to Book Breaks. It is fantastic to have you here on the program.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
And I love to kick off our conversations here on Book Breaks by asking our guests always, what was the inspiration behind writing the book? Why was it important for you to write this book?
Well, first, let me just say thank you for organizing this event and for all the folks who are tuning in, both live and then I know later in recorded form. So thanks for tuning in and for organizing. This book was important to me just even as a person because my parents are immigrants from South Korea. They immigrated under the 1965 Immigration Nationality Act. So my parents came in the 1970s. My mom was a nurse, and so she was able to get a visa under the skilled qualifications of the jobs provisions of the 65 Act. And so I had seen how my own family's history was directly shaped by US immigration policy, as well as kind of knowing a little bit more about South Korean history and kind of the role that the US had played in South Korean history. I was also aware kind of this longer history that brought my family to the point where they came to the US in the 1970s. But one question that I always found really interesting was, I spent a lot of time in college learning about the exclusion laws. And I think most or many folks, not all, learn about the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. A lot of folks who teach APUSH classes, for example, teach that. And sometimes the AP history test will cover those topics. But a lot of folks had been on the exclusion laws, how they came to be and their impact. And I think that's a really important story. But I think what a lot of folks hadn't thought much about was kind of how these laws ended, because clearly they did, because we got to the place in the 1970s where my parents could come and where you have an incredible influx of Asian immigration after 1965. And so, I think I wanted to think about this longer history of kind of the prehistory to my own parents' immigration. So how did the United States get to the point where once it had excluded Chinese and then later all Asians by 1924, but then how did you get from 1924 to 1965? So what happened during that period and what really created or led to the push to enlarge, right, the boundaries, who gets to enter the United States, but also who gets to become a US citizen? So that was so thinking about my own family's history, I was really interested in the prehistory that enabled my own family's immigration.
And what's interesting is even just in the title of your book, you call it a Transpacific history. Can you kind of give a broad overview why you decided to call it a Transpacific history? Because was really interesting reading in the book that it isn't just US centric in this way, that actors in the countries talked about, be it China, Philippines, India, also played critical roles in helping to end these laws. Can you give us a broad overview?
Definitely. I mean, I think my work, I was actually trained as a diplomatic historian. So I'm a diplomatic historian of US and the world, as well as an immigration historian. And I focus particularly on race and policy. But I mean, I think there's been a general push within US history, to think more about the global context in which US lawmakers in Congress, US, lawmakers generally, kind of US state officials, to think about kind of how the United States is engaged with the broader world. And I think immigration policy is one of those areas where it's, in many ways, it should be quite obvious that the United States, right, immigration policy is both domestic policy, but it's also foreign policy. So in many ways, I think what the quote internationalization or globalization of US history over the past few decades in particular has enabled a lot of us to see is just the ways in which even those kind of boundaries between domestic and foreign policy are kind of artificial, right? That when you think about why US lawmakers, when you think about even why Supreme Court justices in 1954 decided to desegregate schools in Brown v. Board, right? I think historians like Mary Didziak have shown how kind of histories that many Americans have long understood as domestic kind of in nature are actually, you know, they're actually connected very much to US global interests as well. And so I think with immigration policy, I mean, historically, when you think about kind of US immigration policy toward Asia, you can't ever ignore US-Asia relations and the ways in which immigration policy, and to some extent naturalization policy as well, are kind of entangled with US kind of military interests, economic interests, political interests, and what many historians would call kind of US empire in places like Asia, not just Asia, but, you know, particularly focusing on Asia geopolitics as a kind of primary factor shaping US immigration policy. So I think in many ways you could argue that you can't really talk about the repeal of exclusion without talking about what the US is doing in Asia during this period.
And you mentioned the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. Through your book, you taught it was really incredible reading how complicated all the different immigration laws were, and it was a growing level of different restrictions against different ethnic groups from different parts of Asia, leading up to 1924, which was exclusion for immigration almost across the board. Can you talk a little bit about the development of these exclusionary laws for the different groups from Asia?
Definitely. And this is actually one history. I mean, these histories have been really well documented by historians, including Erica Lee, May Nye, Beth Lou Williams. There are so many historians who have written excellent histories of kind of the origins and development of Asian exclusion. So, you know, the Chinese are the first targets, and I think many of us know, right? Chinese are the first targets, Chinese women, right, with Page Law of 1875, which I think has become a lot more discussed after the shootings in Atlanta in March of this year. So the 1875 Page Law, 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, those really targeted Asian women, or sorry, Chinese women, particularly, and then Chinese workers. But then what fewer people realize is that after Chinese exclusion is passed, over the next few decades, many of the same exclusionists who are pressuring Congress to, you know, exclude the Chinese, they turn their attention to other Asian groups. So by 1906, 1907, you have the Gentlemen's Agreement, which restricts Japanese workers and their migration to the United States. There is a really particular moment, though, where you see kind of US foreign policy interests, right, geopolitics, shape Japanese exclusion very differently, right? So Congress never passes a Japanese Exclusion Act because Japan is seen as a global power, and the White House, Congress did not want to insult the Japanese government in the same way they had, quote, insulted the Chinese government. And so, you know, Japanese exclusion or Japanese restriction is more informal. By the time you get to, so you have Chinese, then you have Japanese, and along with the Japanese, Koreans are also restricted under that gentleman's agreement, because Korea by this time has come under Japanese rule, Japanese colonial rule between 1907 and 1910. So you have kind of those two groups restricted. By 1917 and 1924, those are the two moments where Congress begins to put blanket restrictions on all, quote, Asiatics, and I'll say a little bit more about that. 1917 is this moment. 1917 is actually a huge moment for US immigration because it really marks the beginning of the move toward restriction. I don't know how many folks remember this history, the Immigration Restriction League, right, led by a lot of Harvard-educated folks who consider themselves very Anglo-Saxon. 1917 marks kind of the first literacy tests on European immigration, and those are targeted really at Southern and Eastern Europeans. But that 1917 law also creates the Asiatic barred zone. And so historians like May Nye have argued that essentially you begin to see the racial category that we today kind of understand as Asian or Asian American, right? That racial category is created by the law, that term Asiatic. And so the Asiatic barred zone, it's part of the 1917 law. Congress kind of draws a big rectangular structure around what we now consider most of Asia. It basically says anyone in this zone is barred from long-term immigration. Again, Japan is actually strategically exempted from that barred zone because Congress and the White House don't want to insult Japan. So again, you see kind of how geopolitics shapes exclusion in very particular ways. But the 1917 Act actually was specifically targeted at Indians because they were seen as kind of the next Asiatic invasion. So you have, by 1917, the Asiatic barred zone, and 1924 is a kind of defining moment where not only do you have the national origins quota system, which now strategically targets Eastern and Southern European immigration, but all Asian immigration, so all Asiatic immigration is barred, including Japan. And so you basically have, a complete bar on Asian immigration. At the same time that the 1924 Act also kind of reaffirms that Asians are barred from US citizenship. And that's, part of, I think, the story, this is the last thing I'll say, part of the story, I think, of kind of Asian immigration that's really interesting to think about is the ways in which immigration and then naturalization policy, they actually kind of developed very independently before 1924, because I don't know how many folks have studied citizenship policy, but by 1924, so essentially the people who could naturalize as US citizens are free white persons, that's under the 1790 Naturalization Act, persons of African descent, and that clause was added after the Civil War. And then by 1924, Native Americans are also given US citizenship. But US citizenship, naturalization doesn't become kind of race neutral until 1952. And so in 1924, Congress says basically says aliens ineligible to citizenship are barred from immigration under this act. And so the law doesn't actually strategically say Asians are barred. They say aliens ineligible to citizenship. But because of the way that naturalization policy had kind of developed, that category, right, aliens ineligible to citizenship referred really to Asians because they were barred from US citizenship historically.
And then over the next 20 years, we move into the period of when these exclusionary laws are slowly starting to be taken apart, but also you argue that the US's role in Asia now is changing as well from what we would call a more formal empire to an informal empire. Can you talk about the first chapter where we look at the change in relationship with China and the Chinese exclusionary laws and how those are starting to be taken apart?
Yeah, so that campaign, it's a 1943 World War II campaign. I think that one, if folks have studied any kind of part of this history of repeal, that's the one that folks probably are familiar with. And this is in many ways, in some ways, a more straightforward story. During World War II, the United States is allied with China, and this is China under Chiang Kai-shek. And, the Chinese they do most of the fighting against Japan in the Pacific front of World War II. And so the United States has a policy called the Europe First policy, where throughout World War II, they are primarily interested in winning the war against Germany. And so most US supplies, most US troops go to Europe first. And so the United States, FDR, US State Department, US military officials, they're really dependent on the Chinese to keep up the fight against Japan. And so during this period, you have a lot of discontent by Chiang Kai-shek and other Chinese officials, because again, you have millions of Chinese are fighting, they're dying, and they're not getting a lot of support from the other allied powers. And so you have Madame Chiang Kai-shek, the wife of Chiang Kai-shek, right, comes to the United States. She's the first woman to give a speech before a joint session of Congress in 1943. And she specifically says, like, China needs your help, right? And we need more supplies, we need more support in the fight against Japan. And so historians have argued that the repeal of Chinese exclusion, it's one of the kind of more symbolic measures that the United States takes to appease their Chinese allies, to keep China in the war against Japan. Along with that, I think Congress also repeals extraterritoriality. Like, there are other specific measures that US Congress takes that FDR also pushes. Because during World War II, the Japanese, they're really engaged in many different propaganda fronts. And I'm sure some folks might have studied these. But one thing that Japan does is they begin to focus on the Chinese exclusion laws in the US in their propaganda. And they specifically, in propaganda messages to the Chinese, they say, your ally, your US ally excludes you. They are racist against you, right? So basically the Japanese are trying to get the Chinese to leave the allies and join the Axis powers. And this really alarms many, it alarms FDR. It also alarms a lot of US congressional lawmakers. And so there's a number of hearings about this. I've seen congressional reprints, like excerpts, right, excerpting Japanese propaganda broadcasts. And so really, again, the repeal of Chinese exclusion happens during this period, specifically because of the war. There are a lot of congressional lawmakers, especially Southern Democrats, who don't want to. They don't want to loosen any restrictions on immigration, but they are cajoled, right? They are persuaded by the wartime necessity argument. And so that's how you see Chinese exclusion get repealed. The really interesting thing, however, is that behind the scenes, and I think this is what you alluded to, behind the scenes, other Asian groups begin to make similar demands because they see this as their opportunity. Like, look, the United States is beginning to loosen and repeal the exclusion laws. So you have Indians behind the scenes, so Indians in the US, as well as Indian government officials from India who are lobbying behind the scenes. You have Koreans behind the scenes and Filipinos as well. So this is something that congressional lawmakers had warned against. Congressional Democrats, basically, Southern Democrats argued, if you loosen Chinese repeal, you're going to invite a flood of similar demands from other Asian groups. So they actually warned about this. They warned against this. But in fact, that is what happens, right? Other Asian groups begin to make similar demands. And that's kind of where my story, the story of repeal, begins.
And I just want to jump then to the Philippines, because that's also a really interesting example. It is a US colonial possession after the 1898 Spanish-American War. And then as the country is shifting, getting ready for independence, there's also the involvement of the Philippines domestic political front also trying to influence the change of laws for Philippine people in the United States. Can you talk a little bit about how the exclusionary laws changed for the Philippines as they shifted towards independence?
Yeah, I think this goes to the question that you asked earlier about the shift in US empire from formal to informal. And so that is the big story, right? And I think really what you begin to see during this period, and this is an argument that many historians have made about US empire. So I'm drawing from a lot of their work, historians like Takashi Fujitani, Paul Kramer, and others. So the argument is that really after World War II, kind of US empire, so the United States shifts from a more formal to informal kind of form of empire because essentially during this period, you have the beginning of decolonization. So post-World War II, I think the biggest story, and this is something that I think a lot of folks might teach, or the biggest story of the 20th century, I mean, is the Cold War. That's one. But then the second biggest story of the 20th century is decolonization, where you begin to see basically the transition of colonies across the non-white world largely from, they basically shift from colonies of another, right, imperial power to independent nation states. And so 1945, the post-war period really begins this process. And the place where this shift begins, decolonization happens, is Asia. So it happens first in Asia, and then later it happens in Africa during the 50s and 60s. The United States is really, really active in Asia, and it's really involved in this whole history of decolonization. So we know that, you know, if folks have studied the Spanish-American War, the United States is a formal colonial power. The United States, after the Spanish-American War, 1898, set up a formal colonial government in the Philippines. And by the time you get to the 1940s, there are colonized people across Asia who basically say, we're not going to remain colonized anymore. And so 1945, right, Koreans declare independence from Japan. 1946, the United States gives the Philippines independence. 1947, India declares independence, or India is given independence by Great Britain. Pakistan is formed as an independent country. And so you see this across all of Asia. And so the argument historians make is that essentially the United States still exerts a lot of influence and hegemony, basically a lot of informal imperial powers. The United States is still really involved in the economic affairs of other countries. It still is sending US troops throughout Asia. It sets up military bases in places like Okinawa, the Philippines, and other places in Asia. So it's not that US, quote, imperial power goes away. It's just that it changes form because people on the ground are not willing to put up with kind of formal, right, military colonization. The thing about informal empire, though, is that you actually need some level of buy-in or cooperation on the part of the peoples that you're trying to control. And so, because you have troops on the ground, the United States has troops on the ground, it has economic interests. And so when folks talk about, this is a big story of the Cold War, the idea of America trying to win hearts and minds across the world. So when US officials are thinking about this, right, how are they going to win Asian hearts and minds in places like the Philippines, India, these newly independent places, right? How are they going to get buy-in from Asian peoples? One thing they do is, they decide, okay, they're going to pass at least symbolic measures, repealing Asian exclusion, in order to show Asian peoples that the United States is not racist, right? That it's not racist, and that they're anti-colonial, right? So they support, right, the independence claims of Asian peoples. And so repeal, at this point, it's quite symbolic. And I think that's the part that I should mention. These early repeal laws in the 1940s, 1950s, they do repeal exclusion. So, in 1943, Congress says Chinese can now become US citizens. And that's a big deal, right? Because that reverses centuries of Chinese exclusion from citizenship. But then Congress gives China an immigration quota of 105 per year, right? So the immigration quotas that Congress gives to places like India, the Philippines, Pakistan, they're quite small. They're between 100 and 185 per year, very, very small. And so the repeal laws are symbolic, but they begin basically this kind of, Congress is responding to kind of US foreign policy interests and US imperial interests in Asia. So out of necessity, they passed these laws. I should say, however, that these laws are still highly contested. So it actually takes a lot. And I think that's what you're alluding to. It takes a lot to get these laws through Congress, especially in the case of the Indians and in the Philippines. And so what's interesting about those two cases is that, India and the Philippines, they're newly independent, and Indian and Philippine colonial officials based in Asia, they're really lobbying hard behind the scenes because they have their own reasons for supporting these pieces of legislation. And in the case of the Philippines, which you asked about, Philippine colonial officials, in 1946, the Philippines has gotten independence, formal independence, but these colonial officials they're actually really concerned about how the Philippines is going to make money. They're really concerned about going bankrupt because, the Philippines has just undergone several years of Japanese occupation. So, and a lot of the country is actually in rubble because of the fighting with the Japanese during World War II. And so, the Philippine colonial officials, they basically asked themselves, what are our new streams of revenue? And one major revenue stream had been from Filipinos living in the United States. They had been sending something called remittances. They've been sending money back to the Philippines. And even today, that's a big story of kind of overseas Filipinos. But that history is quite long. So by the 1940s, Filipinos sending money back to the Philippines, they're sending a lot of money back. And so part of the reason why Philippine officials are so motivated to support Philippine citizenship bills and other bills in Congress is they're trying to win the support and win the kind of goodwill of Filipinos in the United States. And Indian colonial officials have their own reasons for getting involved during this period. But I guess what those campaigns and what those stories kind of show is that there are many different people involved in these repeal campaigns, and they support repeal legislation for many different reasons. And I think that's important for us to think about, the diversity of interest, the diversity of actors who are pushing for repeal, sometimes publicly and many times behind the scenes.
And that's actually a perfect lead into the next question, is about some of the different leagues that were set up in the United States among Japanese Americans, Indian Americans. Can you talk a little bit about the work of all these different organizations and how they were lobbying Congress to start actually repealing these laws, because it was actually shocking to read how small the quotas were as these laws were being taken apart, because a hundred people is such a small amount.
Yeah, and this is a part of the project that I really appreciated. So when I think about this kind of what I call the Transpacific movement to repeal Asian exclusion, I talk about, right, Asian officials in Asia. I talk about white Americans in the United States, people like Pearl Buck, Henry Luce, the Time Life founder, Roger Baldwin, the ACLU, and Congress people in both the Republican and Democratic Party. So it's a kind of bipartisan effort in some ways. But the piece that I think, I found really interesting in particular was, Asians living in the United States. And many of these folks, I think a lot of them are not citizens, and they're actually barred from US citizenship. So their participation raised a lot of questions about, as someone who is barred from US citizenship as a non-citizen, what can you do? You can't vote, you don't have formal electoral power, but what are some other ways you can exert influence? And so that was one of the things I found really interesting. So, I mean, in the case of Japanese Americans, a lot of those folks were US citizens. And so they kind of had their own arguments, and I can speak more about that. But then for most of the Indians, the Filipinos who were trying to lobby US Congress for these repeal bills, they're non-citizens, but I tell stories about how, for example, in the Indian campaign, it was really 5 Indian kind of people living in Jersey City, New Jersey. They took a bus down from Jersey City to Washington, D.C. They went to Capitol Hill and they knocked on the door of Samuel Dickstein, who is a congressman who was the chair of the House Immigration Committee. And they explained their situation. They explained kind of why they wanted US citizenship and why they wanted these bills passed. And he actually sponsored legislation in the late 1930s, early 1940s on their behalf. So I think the stories that I tell here of Asians in the United States, on the one hand, I think they do support the idea that for many Asians in the United States, for some of them, they did want to claim a space in the United States. Because I think oftentimes when I think Americans think about, like, why do people fight for citizenship? Why do people fight for greater immigration access? Because they want to be American, right? So there is a kind of general, I think that's a very kind of general assumption, a kind of traditional story. And there are many folks for whom that's true. For Japanese Americans in particular, right? This is after World War II incarceration, the Japanese American Citizens League launches campaigns to get citizenship for Japanese Americans and for foreign-born Japanese Americans. Because if you're born in the United States, right, that's the one exception. So for many Japanese Americans born in the United States, they are US citizens by birth, but they're fighting for citizenship rights for their parents, for foreign-born Japanese immigrants. And the arguments they make are kind of martial citizenship, martial patriotism. Like, we fought in this war, the 442nd, the 110th Military Battalions fought in World War II. People died for this country. And so, we really fought for the right to citizenship with our blood. And so our parents and other Japanese should have the right to US citizenship. So there are many kind of Japanese Americans who make those kinds of arguments. So that fits in some ways with kind of ethnic histories, right, of US citizenship and fighting for inclusion. But then there are also those Asians in the United States who are fighting for repeal legislation for other reasons. For some of them, right, they just want jobs. And there are New Deal programs leading into the 1930s, 1940s, or New Deal programs that are restricted to citizens only, right? And so it's for financial necessity, right, that they're trying to get citizenship. They're trying to get greater rights. There are Indians and Filipinos for whom, they believe that getting repeal legislation passed by US Congress will make a sort of, right, would have foreign policy consequences to kind of bolster Indian and Philippine independence movements in Asia, right? So there are many different kind of diverse motivations driving Asians in the United States to participate as well. And I wanted to kind of show that diversity because I think it underscores the idea that people have all kinds of reasons to become US citizens. And I think, it kind of, and that's been true throughout history. That's probably true today as well. And I think it's important for us to think about, to understand what those different motivations are and to understand the many meanings that US citizenship can have to different groups of people.
And it was actually really interesting to read the case of soldiers from the Philippines who fought in World War I and how there were a number of laws that actually excluded them from the benefits that were bestowed on veterans of World War II. Can you just briefly talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and this is a really important story that's in many ways still ongoing. It's you could even just Google it, the rescission campaigns. So um, thousands and thousands of Filipinos fought in World War II under the US flag, because throughout World War II, the Philippines was still a US colony. And I think some folks might know, some folks might not, but when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in Hawaii in 1941, within hours, they also invaded the Philippines and other US territories as well, specifically because they were US territories and US colonies. And the Japanese occupied the Philippines through 1944, early 1945. And during that time, the United States passed special provisions that said, Filipinos, if you fight for the United States, we will give you US citizenship, right? You will have access to US citizenship and special benefits. And so again, tens of thousands, I think hundreds of thousands of Filipinos in the Philippines enlisted to fight under the US flag. And they fought. And, many of them suffered as a result. I think some folks might know, right, the kind of Japanese wartime atrocities in the Philippines, the Bataan Death March, right? There are particular moments that show the level of suffering in the Philippines during World War II. But during this period, Congress begins so after kind of passing those initial proclamations promising US citizenship to Filipino soldiers, Congress quietly begins to kind of renege on some of these same promises. And so by 1944, 1945, 46, they begin to pass the Rescission Acts, which restricts kind of when Filipinos can apply for US citizenship and makes it really difficult for folks to actually get on the path to citizenship. And then after the war is over, 45, 46, Congress passes another Rescission Act, basically saying that veterans benefits given to most World War II veterans will not be given to Filipino veterans. And those acts in the 1940s, there have been many decades of activism by Filipinos and their families, even through the present. I mean, I think in the last 10 to 15 years, there have been US Congress today has passed a series of laws that enable some Filipino veterans to get retroactive citizenship, some Filipino veterans to get retroactive benefits for their families. And keep in mind, we're now in 2021. So this is right. This is more than half a century later. Some Filipino veterans and their descendants are still fighting for these benefits. And so that kind of history it continues very much into the present day. But I think what it underscores is just the kind of limitations, right, on the benefits given to Filipinos, particularly because of their colonial status, and the ways in which the United States and the Philippines have had this really ambivalent relationship even after independence.
And then I'm coming towards the end here because we want to get to the audience questions, but you brought up the really interesting point that leading up to the 1965 Hart-Celler Act, which really opened up immigration. But I want you to briefly, if you could please talk about Hawaii and the entrance of Hawaii into the Union as a state in 1959 and why this was so critically important for Asian immigration. And then actually that the 1965 Hart-Celler Act, the influx of Asian Americans in some ways was an unintended consequence of that act.
Yeah, so I think the kind of big story that this book tells is a very ambivalent story. So the book is not about kind of a triumphal story about how the United States, became less racist and then repealed Asian exclusion in order to admit many more Asians. What's interesting is that throughout this period, for most of the lawmakers, for many of the advocates even who supported the repeal legislation, their goal was not to increase Asian immigration to the United States in any meaningful way. The fact that it did happen was, as you mentioned, and this is an argument made by many historians, David Reimers and others, it was an unintended consequence. It was unexpected, and for many folks, it was probably undesired, right? Because the 1965 Immigration Act, the reason why in the very last weeks, the reason why congressional lawmakers tweaked it to really favor family reunification over job skills was that the assumption was if you make this law primarily focused on family reunification, you're going to limit the number of non-European immigrants entering the United States. And so that's why that law was structured the way that it was. What lawmakers didn't expect, however, was that the majority of people who took advantage of that law were people from Latin America and Asia. And so that's why since that law took effect in the late 1960s, the majority of immigrants coming to the US have been from Asia and Latin America. In the case of Asian immigration, I mean, what the second half of the book really does is to kind of complicate the relationship between Black civil rights and Asian immigration, because I think for many scholars, the assumption for a long time was that these are kind of parallel movements. They're kind of complementary, right? It's the same advocates, the same opponents, right, of both. But what I show is that there are particular moments when Black civil rights activists, like NAACP activists, for example, actually come into direct conflict with supporters of Asian immigration, of exclusion repeal. Like 1952, there's a moment. And so there are moments of kind of fleeting cooperation, like Japanese Americans, for example, testify at anti-lynching bill hearings before Congress in the late 1940s. You have Japanese American Citizens League representatives testifying alongside NAACP representatives. And so there are moments where folks work together, African Americans and Asian Americans. But the way that immigration law gets written after kind of 1952, right, Congress actually, in the same move in 1952, where Congress admits Asians, kind of creates quotas for more Asian countries in 1952, repeals racial restrictions on citizenship. The same law that does this places huge restrictions on Black immigration from the Caribbean. And so ultimately, you know, the bottom line is that because African American, Asian American like representatives, they're not the ones who are actually writing legislation. They're not the ones who are actually voting on it in Congress in large numbers. And so that really limits how much they can accomplish through their lobbying. And so that's why the Hawaiian statehood issue becomes important, because in 1959, Hawaii becomes a state and it sends some of the first Asian Americans to Congress. There had been like a South Asian representative from California by this point, but you have Japanese Americans, and then the first Asian American in the Senate, Hiram Fong, is a Chinese American who's elected in 1959. And some of these folks become really outspoken supporters of Asian immigration. And so some of them are involved, Hiram Fong, Spark Matsunaga, they're involved in the immigration debates leading up to 1965. And it's different now because they're actually in Congress. So they can speak on the bills, but they also have a vote. But I mean, this is another moment where that relationship between Asian immigration and civil rights becomes complicated again, because there are questions about kind of to what extent do Hawaii representatives support civil rights for Black Americans? To what extent do they see themselves as sharing something in common? So I talk about that as well in the last chapter of the book. But ultimately, the 65 Immigration Act, as I mentioned before, it does pass. And that is a transformative moment, even if the lawmakers themselves don't realize what they're doing when they pass it.
And this will be my last question so that we can go to the audience questions. And the majority of our audience are students and teachers. And reading through the book and realizing what a complex issue and the decades-long issue that immigration law is, for when teachers bring it into the classroom, how can they help make it, you know, digestible for students to understand these very complicated and fluctuating acts and laws and different situations? But then, like, leading up to 1965, you even mentioned in the book, it's like with the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, the Hart-Celler Act is kind of this almost unknown act of that same period, but it has been so critical for the development of the United States.
No, this is a great question, something I've been thinking about too, because I'm teaching a summer course on US and the world, and we just read the Didziak, one of the Didziak, Mary Didziak articles, looking at Brown v. Board in 1954 as a Cold War case. And I think, and her book, The Cold War Civil Rights, is, you know, transformative in terms of how historians teach the civil rights movement in a global context. I think the repeal movement reminds us of similar things. First, so I think if when I teach this in the classroom, I talk about the ways in which these histories cannot be taught apart from a kind of more global framework. The book that I wrote, however, so I am interested in the Cold War particularly, but I'm also interested in how the Cold War overlaps with decolonization, because like I said before, historians who study just all regions of the world really, Cold War is really big, but the Cold War overlaps with decolonization. They're not exactly the same story, but they're overlapping stories. And part of, I think, what diplomatic historians have done a lot of work to tease out is how do these two frameworks, how do these two histories overlap, right? Because on the one hand, the United States is really, interested in anti-communism, containing communism across the world. And it's interested particularly in containing communism in newly independent countries like India, the Philippines. But there are moments when kind of decolonization, there are moments when perhaps Cold War understandings of particular moments are not sufficient to explain everything. And I think repeal is one of those moments where you can't just argue that it's just fully a kind of Cold War movement. It also has to do with independence movements, anti-colonial movements among Asian peoples, and questions about US lawmakers, US officials in the post-war period are really obsessed with this idea of a race war. And they're really, really afraid of the third world rising up, these newly independent countries, newly independent peoples rising up against the West. And so I think, thinking about these frameworks, these lenses together, I think is really important. But then, so first is just kind of the global framework, the global context, thinking about the Cold War and decolonization as entangled, but not exactly the same. And also thinking about the ways in which, really different racialized groups in American history have distinct histories of oppression and discrimination, right? I think the ways that Asian Americans have been racialized and restricted by immigration laws, naturalization laws, is different from the ways in which African Americans have been kind of marginalized and oppressed by laws, the ways that Latinx peoples have been targeted and oppressed by immigration and deportation laws. So, I mean, this is really where, I'm going to say the word, right? Critical race theory has been really, I think, helpful to kind of thinking about how different racialized groups have been racialized differently and the role that law has played in those stories. As historians, though, I don't even think you need to use critical race theory to make these arguments. You could just use history. I don't think you even need to use those terms, critical race theory. They are useful, but historians have already shown Jim Crow. So historical laws governing slavery, Jim Crow laws, right? These are laws, these are policies, and that have racialized African Americans as second-class citizens, right, throughout history. And so those histories of kind of racialized oppression look different from Asian American histories, from Latinx histories. And so I think understanding those differences is really important at the same time as kind of understanding what these different racialized communities share in common, which is, right, it's racialized oppression by structures, by policies, right? Structural racism really is the common thread that binds all of these histories together.
Professor Hong, thank you for this wonderful conversation. I'm going to hand you over to Will, who is going to ask you questions from the audience, starting with our weekly student question winner.
Thank you.
So this week's student question winner is from Joanna B. And it's, how does the Chinese Exclusion Act still affect people today, if at all?
No, that's a great question. I think, that the Chinese Exclusion Act, as well as the Asian Exclusion Acts more generally, I think many historians have argued persuasively that when you exclude an entire group, an ethnic group, and then later a racial group because of their ethnicity and race, I think the argument is those laws have contributed to the racialization of Asians as foreign. The idea that, this history of excluding people based on their race, it can help racialize Asians as un-American, right? Perpetually foreign. And so I think many scholars would say that even today, when folks ask, for example, when folks ask me, like, where are you from? I'm actually from New Jersey, and I was born in Brooklyn, and my parents are immigrants from South Korea. But when folks ask me, like, where are you from? And I say New Jersey, and they look very skeptical. Even that idea, right? That idea of kind of people's confusion, because I think the expectation often is I'm going to say some Asian country. So the idea that folks still kind of look at Asian Americans and think about kind of their connections to Asia, even that idea, one could argue, is in part a legacy of the Asian exclusion laws and the ways that laws have shaped how people view different racial groups.
The next question from the audience is from Leslie, and she asks, as immigration comes in waves, I become aware that there's a class and ethnic difference in Asian immigration. Were upper class Asians involved in the exclusion and opening to Asians, and kind of in what ways?
Yeah, I mean, I think upper class Asian Americans in the United States, you have some folks, right? So, in the 1940s and 1950s, it was actually really expensive to fly to Washington, D.C. from places like California. So for many of the Japanese Americans, for example, who were really involved in lobbying Congress, these generally were people with some education, with some means. So they were not necessarily workers. So there is some class diversity within the movement. So there's those Japanese Americans who tend to be more upper, kind of middle class, upper middle class. But then you have other examples like the Indians I mentioned earlier, who took the bus down from Jersey City, New Jersey. I think several of them worked as auto mechanics. They had worked as farmers before becoming mechanics. Those folks were more working class. And so, that fact that they were able to participate in these campaigns, I think is really remarkable as well in the 1940s, 1930s, 1940s. And so there is some class diversity, but of course, I think it's just, even today, it's probably a lot easier for folks who have some means to take the time out to, lobby Congress, take trips to DC, knock on congressmen's doors, and kind of, it's folks who have some amount of education and knowledge who are able to do those kinds of things. So there is diversity, but definitely folks with more education and means had an easier time participating.
The next question is from Kristen, and it goes off a bit of your discussion of sources. Maybe you've talked about the congressional records a bit, but Kristen is wondering about, in your research, how did you figure out how the various different groups in the US talked about these changes to immigration law happening in the 1960s, and where, if we can see, the spike in anti-Asian nativism, where can we find that in the sources? And then also, where can we find kind of the records of advocacy and so forth from different groups?
No, the question of sources is really important. I think historically, you can just look at newspapers, right, to see evidence of anti-Asian sentiment and then violence. Really, a lot of any number of newspapers historically. A lot of my sources were congressional sources. I went to Washington, D.C. and College Park, the National Archives, spent a lot of time in those documents. So looking at transcripts from congressional hearings where people met together. You had Asian witnesses who testified before Congress. And so we have all those transcripts. And those are actually pretty easily accessible online. There's actually databases where you can find all of those. But I also did research into Congress actually collects all the letters that are sent in regarding a certain topic. And so there are files where you can go to see those. But one of the most, the more original pieces of my sources is that I spent time in India, the Philippines, and actually also South Korea. I took those parts out of my book ultimately, but I spent time in the Indian and Philippine National Archives looking at the role that those governments played in the repeal campaigns in the 1940s and 1950s. And a lot of my sources from those chapters, the Philippine and Indian chapters, came from those Indian and Philippine archives. And I think that's really important because, again, if we're going to say that this was a Transpacific movement where you had people outside the United States lobbying Congress and involved in this movement for repeal, then it's really important to try to understand kind of where they were coming from, why they were involved, and what they were doing behind the scenes. And so I think those sources were really important, I think, to the writing of this book.
So going off of that, there's a question from Christopher about the two different kind of movements, the domestic and the international movements for this repeal. And he asked, to what extent did internal pressures from different Asian American groups matter more than external pressures from foreign governments in Asia? How far did this vary depending on the US view of each country's geostrategic importance in the developing Cold War?
That's an excellent question. And that really highlights the tension, right? Because in writing this book, I wrote about 5 different campaigns in particular. And the book covers Chinese, Japanese, Philippine, and Indian repeal campaigns. And again, as I mentioned, I wrote about the Korean campaigns earlier in my previous drafts and then kind of deleted them from the final book. But you're right, in each of these cases, the United States government has different interests in India, China, the Philippines, and Japan over different periods of time. So it also, not only does each group kind of look different to US foreign policymakers, but over 1943 to 1965, US interest in each of these places also shifts and changes. So I think you're right in pointing out the tensions. I guess the thing that I would say in response to the question of to what extent is it domestic actors, to what extent is it kind of foreign policy pressures, in part what the book is trying to do is trying to kind of erase those distinctions, because I think even when you had, this is really interesting, even when you had Japanese Americans, right? US born Japanese Americans lobbying Congress in the 1940s, 1950s for Japanese repeal. Reading these hearings, lawmakers would ask the Japanese Americans are making arguments about how, Japanese Americans fought in World War II. They died for the United States, even when their parents were incarcerated in the incarceration camps, right? So they deserve citizenship. They deserve immigration rights because of their service, their military service to this country. So they're making these arguments. And then lawmakers would ask them, well, tell me about Japan. Tell me about kind of what's happening in Japan. Why is this kind of, tell us about kind of, US Japan, kind of these histories and relations. And these Japanese Americans were just confused, right? Because they were trying to make arguments based on their own American military service. And then lawmakers were asking about Japan. So I think what you really see here, and this happens in many different campaigns, is they're really inseparable. And you can't really easily disentangle kind of domestic factors from foreign policy factors, I think, in any of these campaigns. And so that's part of what I was trying to tease out and talk about in the book. It's that it's not, in many ways, these repeal campaigns were both domestic and foreign policy at the same time, and it was really difficult to kind of separate the factors out, if that makes sense.
The next question is from Lois. And it's about some content that you discuss in chapter 5 of your book, which is about the 1965 Hart-Celler Act and the way in which it was, any sort of connections it had with the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And also particularly, there's been some other audience questions that I'm not sure if we're going to be able to get to, but kind of looking particularly at the way, kind of the lead up to that legislation, the interplay between the Black Civil Rights Movement and the Asian Civil Rights Movement, and what that looked like.
No, this is great. I mean, the work of Madalena Marinari, who's a historian at Gustavus Adolphus, she's really done a lot of work on this. The origins of the 65 Hart-Celler Act are different from the 64 and 65 kind of voting rights and civil rights acts. Lyndon B. Johnson wasn't really that invested in immigration reform. He inherited the immigration bill from JFK, from Kennedy, after Kennedy's assassination. I mean, Johnson also inherited the Civil Rights Bill of 64 from Kennedy. But Johnson, if you actually look, and I've talked to people about this, if you look at Lyndon B. Johnson's papers, he speaks actually not that much about immigration. So it's kind of like for him an afterthought. He inherits it from Kennedy, so he will support it to some extent, but not very actively. Immigration reform, too, it's also not very popular among the American public. So Gallup polls in the early 60s find that most Americans don't really support kind of wholesale liberalization of immigration policy. And so when Congress kind of takes up the Hart-Celler law, they kind of do it on their own volition, because Congress by this point has been inundated by immigration reform bills for decades. Keep in mind that Eastern and Southern European American groups have been lobbying Congress to repeal the national origins quota systems since 1924. So for decades, they've been fighting. So Italian American groups, Polish American, Jewish American groups. And so it's not just Asian immigration advocates who are lobbying Congress. It's actually just immigration reformers generally. And so Congress, decides the immigration system is broken. We need to reform it. So this is kind of overdue. So let's just kind of rewrite these policies, because it's a mess. The immigration policy system is a mess by the early 1940s. So Congress kind of takes up immigration of its own, kind of on its own terms. A lot of folks within Congress agree that this is necessary. But again, they largely do it apart from kind of public opinion. So it's very insulated. And, again, most Americans don't really support immigration reform. So in many ways, again, like it doesn't really, in some ways it fits within this kind of civil rights trajectory, the 64 Civil Rights and 65 Voting Rights Act. In some ways it does, in the sense that there are Cold War pressures and there are foreign policy pressures pushing Congress to take up immigration reform to make America look less racist in the eyes of the wider world. But in terms of the nitty-gritty on the ground, I think many Congress people, they do think of these laws as connected to some extent, but immigration reform has its own very particular history that in some ways was independent of civil rights legislation. I guess that's what I would say.
And the next question kind of leads out of that, but looking at this law from a different perspective. So Malek, not quite sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but they ask if the 1965 Act intensified or moderated US intervention in Asia.
I mean, that's the thing that's interesting about 65. In looking at some of the hearings, so by this time, this is after the Gulf of Tonkin resolution of 64. This is after the dramatic escalation of US involvement in Vietnam, right, 64, 65. And what's interesting is just there isn't that much discussion of Vietnam in the immigration debates themselves leading up to Hart-Celler. I mean, there's some, and people do, State Department officials come and they testify about US interests in Asia. So there is some. But again, that's not the main it's not the main discussion point. So that kind of in some ways underscores how, Congress people were thinking about immigration reform in kind of more mixed terms by the mid 1960s. I mean, does the passage of this law really reshape US foreign policy toward Asia? I mean, I think maybe over time, the 65 law doesn't actually take effect until 1968. And it takes a while for people to realize that the people coming under the law are not European. It takes a few years. So by the 1970s, people are some observers in the United States are beginning to say like, oh, what's happening, right? Who's actually coming under this law? So I think, there are people who are kind of wondering about the impact. I don't think there's a lot of kind of comprehensive discussion about it. The last thing I will say, though, is that in the 1970s, the Asian immigration piece that becomes really prominent is the question of refugees from post-Vietnam, so Southeast Asian refugees coming to the US. And so in some ways that history, which leads to the 1980 Refugee Act, that is in some ways, independent history of the 65 Act. These two histories do converge, though, in the 1980s and 1990s, because what happens is that you have many folks coming as refugees after the Vietnam War ends. And those refugees, once they get status in the United States, are able to sponsor family members under the 1965 Immigration Act. And so that's why you begin to see even more Southeast Asian immigrants coming in the 80s and 90s and after, not as refugees, but as immigrants. So again, these two kind of legal structures do converge later.
Thank you, Professor Hong, for those great answers, and thank you, audience, for those amazing questions. It was great to be able to chat with you about this. I'm going to hand off the presentation to William to wrap up.
All right, thank you, Professor Hong. And so before I let everyone go, I'm going to share my screen. As you heard, our student question is always one of the winners here. So please, teachers, even through the summer holiday, please keep encouraging your students to submit questions for book breaks. And our winning student always wins a $50 gift certificate to the Gilder Lehrman gift shop. Also, we want to let you know that the George Washington Book Prize is coming up this autumn, and it's going to be October 20th, 2021. And the ceremony is also going to recognize the past winner, Rick Atkinson, who was also a guest here on Book Breaks, for his book, The British Are Coming, The War for America, Lexington to Princeton, 1775 to 1777. And you can see here listed the current 2021 George Washington Book Prize finalists. And if you want to find out more about the George Washington Book Prize, please just head over to gilderlehrman.org. All right. If you would like to purchase Professor Hong's book, The Opening the Gates to Asia, A Transpacific History of How America Repealed Asian Exclusion, please head over to bookshop.org and make sure to purchase your book from there, because not only does it help support the Gilder Lehrman Institute, It also helps support independent bookshops, and we do apologize for the little typo here on this final slide. I hope you'll be able to join us next week on Sunday, July 18th at 2 p.m., when we're going to be joined by Anna Malika Tubbs as she discusses her book, The Three Mothers: How the Mothers of Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and James Baldwin Shaped a Nation. And we're going to be joined by a guest host, Keisha Rembert. So please tune in next week, July 18th. Before that, I hope you'll be able to join for Inside the Vault on Thursday, July 15th at 7 p.m. Eastern. And they're going to examine documents related to the Massachusetts 54th Volunteer Infantry and explore the reality of African-American soldiers in the Civil War. So a big thank you to Professor Hong and our wonderful discussion in writing this fascinating book. Please go out and purchase Professor Hong's book. A big thank you to Will for collecting and asking all those great questions from the audience. And of course, thank you to you, our audience here on Book Breaks, for joining us each week on a Sunday. We appreciate you taking the time to join us here on Book Breaks. So before we say farewell, keep going and reading history, everyone. And we hope you enjoy the rest of your Sunday afternoon. And we hope that you'll be able to join us again here next week on Book Breaks. Thank you and take care, everyone.